Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell, and we are so honored today to be hosting Tracey Baptiste, author of African Icons, 10 People Who Shaped History. What a special day this is, because she will be talking to Peace Adzo Medie, the author of His Only Wife, for a wonderful conversation. And you can ask questions either in the chat function or the Q&A, and we will get to some of those questions after the event. I would say for today's event, we'd like you to stick to the chat because sometimes it's tough for authors to check through different places. This book has won raves from many people, including the great Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote, "In African Icons, Baptiste engages in the hard work of unveiling the myths about the African continent to young readers, a great beginner's guide to colonial Africa." And School Library Journal said, "Baptiste sheds light on the rich and complex pre-enslavement history of the African continent, a spellbinding collection." Tracey Baptiste is also the author of the Jumbie series, Minecraft the Crash, and a forthcoming novel called Because of Claudette. A former teacher, she also works as a writer and editor. Peace Adzo Medie is the author of His Only Wife. She is a Ghanaian British writer and senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. She's joining us all the way from England, which is very exciting. So I'm going to welcome both of you. Thank you both for coming. Welcome to Boswell's virtual series.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you. And hi, Tracey.
Hi, Peace. I did not realize that you were coming to us from so far.
Yeah, I'm in the UK, but I'm so excited to be chatting with you. Thank you to have this conversation about this amazing book. And I should say it took me back. So I read about it in the book and I knew, but some that I didn't know. And I was reading it and I distinctly remember being like, I don't know, 12 or 13 and reading a graphic novel with some historical figures, including Mansa Musa. Because I think what's important about this book is that a lot of these figures and these people are not taught in schools in the US. But so I went to school in Ghana and we actually didn't learn about a lot of these figures. So it's not only like in the US or within Europe that you have this kind of erasure. So anyway, I was reading it and I just had this flashback to being a kid and flipping through these graphic novels of African historical figures, and I just absolutely loved it. So thank you for that experience.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, and I should say there's so many things I like about it, and I'm interested in the writing process. I'm interested in the people you write about and how you chose them. I love that it's in writing this book, you don't only tell us about people, individuals, you tell us about their societies, you tell us about their physical surroundings, you tell us about the politics and the economics of where they are. And I think that makes it such a rich book. And I know it's aimed at young adults, but as you can see, maybe even very not so young adults can benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, the goal was to introduce all of these various people, but I very quickly realized that it was not possible to just talk about the people without talking about their circumstances, the land that they were on, the society that they were a part of. And so that had to be all a part of it. The thing is, when I started working on it, I didn't start with the people, really. I started with kind of major events that had happened. And it was in exploring those major events that I realized that there were all of these different people who had played roles in these major events. So it actually, so most people think that I started out by choosing the icons, but it was really the opposite. So it was the flip side of it. It started with events and then the people came after.
Well, yeah, now that you say it, because I could see how you embedded people's stories within a specific time period, and within like major changes that were occurring across the continent. So now that you explain it, I very much see how the events came before the people, and it offers a very holistic view of these figures. But I mean, you started talking about this a bit, but how did this book come to be? Why did you decide to write this book? What was the motivation behind it?
It was not my idea even to write this book. So this actually started exactly on February 1st, 2017. It was the previous presidential administration. The president had gone to a Black History Month breakfast and clearly did not know anything about Black history. And I have always had a little bit of a pet peeve with how Black history is taught in the United States, where it is always post-enslavement. It is always the same figures over and over again. And I never felt that my kids who grew up in the United States, I grew up in Trinidad in the Caribbean. I never felt that my kids really got a full view of what Black history was. So I was already, had a bit of a peeve about that. And then when this Black History Month breakfast happened, and it was clear that the former president really had no clue about what Black history was, there were a lot of children's book writers like me who were also former teachers who decided to put together some resources about Black History Month for educators. So during the day, people were writing these blog posts with information for teachers. And I noticed that once again, all of the blog posts were post-enslavement. It was about freed slaves, it was about the Reconstruction era, it was about the Civil Rights era, and so on. And so I did a very quick search and put up on my own blog post, maybe about 6 or 7 facts that I had found in a very fast Google search. And I called it Africans Before Slavery. And that actually got quite a bit of attention. My editor, Elise Howard at Algonquin, she saw the blog post and saw that it was getting some attention and said, "Do you want to write a book about this?" And I thought, sure, I would love to do that. I also was not aware of how difficult it was going to be to do the research and how long it was going to take. But at the time I thought, this is a good idea. I have been complaining for such a long time about the lack of history that goes, before enslavement of Africans, and, nobody was doing it. So, here was my chance to actually do something about it instead of just talking about it.
I mean, that's just excellent. And I think I don't think it's only a US issue. I think even in studying Africa in Europe and discussing Africa in Europe, there's this, it's often limited to colonization. When we talk about life on the continent and leaders and just society and economy, there's a tendency to focus on the engagement with Europe when that started, as opposed to the wealth of innovation, the life that existed on the continent prior to this engagement with Europe. So I think this is a problem that stretches beyond the US. But also I think this is also a very important time in the US to be doing something like this, just because there seems to be a lot of resistance in certain quarters to discussing history at all,
Right.
or at least with any kind of accuracy. So I think this makes this a very important book. Were there any particular misconceptions? And I can think of so many, so feel free to say there are just too many. Were there any particular misconceptions that you really wanted to address in writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, you are right that there are really, just so many, but I think the thing that surprised me the most, that I didn't really understand before I started doing the research for this book, was how long African countries and European countries had a relationship. I did not really grasp that there had been centuries of trade, of diplomacy, of friendship that had been going on, and even like military conflict that had been going on between various African countries and various European countries, because there is this idea that Africa was, the quote unquote dark continent, which is not a phrase that I particularly care for various reasons, and that Europeans discovered it and discovered that there were people there who didn't have anything, that the people were wild, they were uneducated, they didn't have culture, and so on. And then they decided to start enslaving those people to enrich their own lands, when, as a matter of fact, the Europeans and the Africans knew each other so well, they knew each other's cultures, to the point where the Europeans understood some of the cultural customs that Africans had. So they knew that, for example, in certain West African countries, when they came and they wanted to have an audience with the king, they would have to throw dust on their head, because you had to bow down and do that. You had to speak with the jailie, who was, the person who did the actual speaking at court, and not the actual king. You never spoke to him directly. You had to go through the jailie. And there were they understood what the rituals were. They knew what the culture was, and they understood it very well. They, in trading with various African countries, especially those in West Africa, they paid taxes to these countries. In the Kingdom of Mali, the reason that Mali was so wealthy in the 1400s was because if you came into Mali, you had to pay taxes just to enter. And then after you did all of your trading and whatnot, and you were heading back home, you had to pay taxes to exit. So there was all of this trade and diplomacy and so on that had been going on for years and years and years. But there had been this perception that I got from my history books that there was no relationship between the two peoples, and that Europeans came to Africa and found really nothing there but, sort of savages running around. And that was clearly not the case.
Can you tell us a bit more about this research? So, I mean, when you read a book and you get to the end, there's a bibliography that directs you to a variety of sources. Can you tell us a bit about what the process was doing this research? What resources did you rely on? What sources did you find to be most useful in conducting this study?
Sure. So I am not a trained researcher at all. I have written some nonfiction books, but I did not study library science. So research is not really what I would consider my forte. It's not my strength at all. So the first thing that I did really was I contacted librarians that I knew. And I said, this is the book that I am doing research on. can you help me? Can you point me in the right direction? And people were really great about telling me about specialized libraries that I could go to find information. And then I would call up the libraries and talk to the librarians and say, okay, this is what I'm looking for. And the librarians would pull books off the shelves and leave them for me. So I would come in to do research, and there would be a desk set aside for me with piles of books and articles and things like that that I could just go through. And then, you know, I would sit there with my laptop or with my notebook and make my notes. And occasionally I would find an article and I would email the author of the article to ask a follow-up question. And they were really great about answering my questions, but also then pointing me in direction of new information or another person that I could talk to who might be able to give me some more information. So one of the people that I met was a woman who is one of the curators at the Met, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And she took me on a personal tour through some of the artwork, some of the African artwork that they had there. And that really opened up a lot of the stories for me about the people. And it was the first time I got that sense of understanding that there had been this longer relationship between African peoples and European peoples. And one of the instances of that in particular was these two statues that I saw, which was from the Lake Chad region. And they were covered in these beads, in these glass beads, and the glass beads were from Venice in Italy. And that really blew my mind, trying to understand how this piece of artwork, wooden carving from Chad, came to be covered in these Venetian glass beads. And she was explaining to me that they traded materials back and forth all the time. And that was really the first time that I understood that there had been this lengthy relationship between African nations and European nations, that they were trading supplies, that they were trading, like they were, intermingling politically, that they had diplomatic ties and all of these things. So I really relied very, very much on people who are much better than me in research, and people were extremely generous with their time and in pointing me to, various places that I could find more information. And then I just kind of slugged through, trying to dig my way through to figure out, what the information was, where all the stories were. And then I would just ask follow-up questions to people who were nice enough to answer my emails.
Well, I mean, I should say, and I so agree with you, that librarians are a secret resource. I don't think people know enough about how awesome librarians are. I tell my students all the time, go to the library, ask questions, talk. Like, they are there and they want to help you. I think most librarians. What?
They really do want to help.
Yeah, and I don't think they get asked enough. I get a sense that librarians feel like they don't have enough people asking them for assistance in the library. And your point about finding out and being surprised that there was this relationship between Africa and Europe is such an important one. Also because not only because that in itself is important, but because of it underlines the fact that it wasn't a relationship of domination or subordination. Because when we tend to think about Africa engaging with whether it's Western Europe or North America, it's always this hierarchical relationship where Africa is receiving and is being dictated to and is asking for help. However, historically, we know that has not, although that was really not the case for many centuries, and that one could say that in some cases it was even reversed. And so I think that is such an important finding. And I think you do a really good job of illustrating these bonds and these connections that have existed over centuries between Africa and other parts of the world. And so apart from, I'm assuming that you found other things that were really surprising, in addition to finding out about there was this relationship, but were there any other things that you found that just was really unexpected, and I guess in a good way or maybe in a bad way also?
Well, one of the things that I came across in my research, but I wasn't able to verify, was that apparently there was a European king who was trying to marry off his daughter to a West African king, because, I mean, this is how people extended their political power back then, like in the medieval period, right? They would ally themselves with a neighboring king, and this is how they would expand their political reach, right? So that when they were having problems with, whoever was the kingdom next door, they could reach out to their child in the other kingdom, and then they would be able to surround their enemies. In this case, it was specifically for access to gold, because there was so much gold that had been found in sub-Saharan Africa, on, in a lot of West African countries south of the Sahara, that this particular king wanted to marry his daughter off so that he could have access to this gold. Hopefully, I guess, without having to pay all of the fines that you generally had to pay to get into the country and do the trade and get back out and pay fines again. Well, taxes, not fines. But I could not verify that story, and I was never really able to find out, exactly which African nation and which European nation was being talked about in that particular conversation. So, there were a lot of little surprising things that were like that, where there were going to be more familial ties between the two places. And if you think about, what happened later on historically, the idea that people of African descent, could not marry, it was against the law to be married to somebody of European descent, or, somebody who was white in the Americas. The idea that something like that was like totally, completely normal was something that, yeah, let's definitely do that because, it's better for us, politically or financially or whatever it was a real surprise to me. So I really had hoped to get more information on that, but, I really could not track down more sources that could verify that story. So there were things like that, like little stories like that popped up every now and then, with these more kind of personal kinds of ties that happened. And I wish that there was more information about that, because, the personal feels much closer. I mean, the political stuff and the socioeconomic stuff is great, and it's good to know that they had all of these relationships, but the personal stuff really feels, well, personal. Like it just feels so much closer and so much more intimate and delicate, knowing that these could have been families just from different places. That was a really interesting idea to me, and one that I wish there was more information about that I could explore.
So that's one of my questions I was going to ask you, was if there were people that you wanted to write about and you couldn't find enough information on them. And this is something I think comes up often, because a lot of African history is oral history that has been passed down from generations. And for that reason, there's just a lot of important information that hasn't been written. And for that reason, there are major gaps in history. So I'm currently studying my great-grandmother, who was a very powerful woman. But despite the role she played, there's almost nothing written about her. And I just began this year seriously studying the topic and went home to do interviews, and there were like 2 people alive who knew her. And so there's this scramble to talk to those people, and trying to look through old photographs and hoping I will find something that I can, use to piece together a story of her. And so I think writing about the past in many places, but especially in Africa, there tend to be a lot of gaps, such that it's you often don't have everything that you need to tell a story. And I wonder what did you do when that happened? So is it that you just didn't write about those people, or do you write about them and just acknowledge that there's much more that I can't say?
I mean, both. It sort of depended on how much information I was able to get and verify, because there was a mountain of information. I mean, the African continent is vast, and, I was looking at a really wide part of history. It was not like I was looking at just one century or anything. I was really looking from the 3000 BC to the 1500s. So it's a really long part of history that I was looking at, and a huge continent. So really what I did was try to gather as much information as I could about each of the people and the things that were happening with them. But of course, there were plenty of times when I found something that was just not verifiable. So I would have to leave it out because I couldn't, find enough information to verify it. Or there were times when I would just make my best guess about what was the most likely thing to have happened. So, for example, in one of the stories, the Kandake Amanirenas, she had gone up against Caesar Augustus, and Caesar Augustus really wanted the lands of Kush. They were just below Egypt, and Rome had just taken over Egypt. So they were moving south. And there is an oral history about Amanirenas sending him a sheaf of arrows, of gold arrows, and saying, these are a gift if we are friends, but if we are not friends, you want to hold on to them anyway because you're going to need it, which is just such a great story. But because it's an oral history, it is impossible to verify whether or not that is true. But as you say, knowing that a lot of African history is oral, I have to assume that that is probably historically accurate. We just do not have, the legacy of history was that the griot, the géli, or whoever was doing the oral histories would teach those histories to the next person coming down, and that's how they would all pass down. But because of enslavement and the Middle Passage, we lost a lot of the people who knew those histories, who had learned those histories, and who would have been able to pass them down. So the fault for me is not so much with the fact that there were oral histories, because there was a plan for those oral histories. Those oral histories were supposed to have been passed down. But because of colonialization, those oral histories were silenced. So, when I come across something like that, I have to assume that that is the correct story, because I know what the oral history meant to the people of that time and of that place. So I will say, there is this legend that says that this is the thing that happened. But of course, I cannot say it in any kind of definitive way because we don't have the actual record. But I can say that most likely this is a true thing that happened. So, so there were definitely 2 ways to approach gaps in information.
And related to that, how do you deal with contested history? Because a lot of history, and I mean, currently, a lot of the current politics is so contested. But also history is contested, and there are some figures like Aesop where there's an agreement on, did this person exist, or did they really live in this time, or did they actually come from Africa? So there's quite a bit of contestation in history. How do you balance this? How do you deal with this in your writing?
Well, as you bring up Aesop, that was one of the ones that made me really nervous. But I felt like I had enough sources that said that he really was an Ethiopian man who had been enslaved and taken to Greece, and that's where the stories were popular. And because I felt like I had enough sources to back that up, then that made me feel comfortable about sticking with that particular story. But the fact is, there is a lot of history that is contested. And sometimes the history that's contested is because that history is, the historians themselves had bias. So these were things that I had to deal with as well. As I was reading through pieces of information, sometimes I would be looking directly into the face of biased retellings. And sometimes you could really, you can tell that very easily, what's more opinion than fact, and then trying to separate out the fact from the opinion so that you can get to, what the most likely true story was without, somebody's feelings getting in the way of it. But then it's also a matter of, just trying to find as many credible sources as I could to verify information. And with Aesop, I felt like I did have enough credible sources that I could say with confidence that this is correct. Is it 100% absolutely irrefutably correct? I don't know. There may be somebody who comes up with new evidence in the future that says something else. But the great thing about history and the great thing about stories, similar to science, is that when we know something, we put it down, and when we know better, we add to the story. And so my real hope is that these stories really are the beginning of somebody else's research so that they can add to what I have here. I make it very clear in the stories that there is still so much to learn. And I very much hope that this is a jumping off point for other people to find other stories, to find more stories, to find different stories, so that we can add to this historical record. Because as you say, there are so many gaps to fill in.
Yes, I think it would be incredible if this kind of started a conversation. I know in history, in academia, these are ongoing conversations, but just in the everyday, in popular culture, it will be interesting, and among young people, if this could start a conversation and kind of generate more interest in Africa and African history beyond enslavement.
Right.
So I think this is an important first step. I wonder, who's your favorite of the 10 figures? Who's your favorite? And I'll tell you mine, it's Mansa Musa. And I think it's because, once again, I distinctly remember reading about him as a child and his caravan of gold, going on the pilgrimage to Hajj. And so and I remember, like I said in the beginning, it was a graphic novel of some sort. So there were actually photos. So I still remember them. So I think that's why he's my favorite. Even though I was going to say actually, a woman should be my favorite, but maybe not. A woman shouldn't be my favorite just because she's a woman. But yeah, so Mansa Musa definitely is my favorite, but it's childhood nostalgia. So who's your favorite person in the book?
Amon Arenas really is probably my favorite person. Just this idea of her going toe to toe with Caesar Augustus was just incredible to me. And also the idea that she, like, everybody knows, well, not everybody, but most people know who the Pharaoh Cleopatra was. Like, there's so many stories about Cleopatra. And Amon Arenas lived at the same time. The likelihood is that they knew each other very well. When Cleopatra ended her life by suicide, she was attempting to send her children south to an Ethiopian queen. So she would have had to have sent them through Kush. So I can't imagine that a mother is going to send her children off to someplace that she doesn't know, where there's nobody where she would have had friends, that she would have known anyone. So my assumption has to be that Cleopatra and Amon Arenas knew each other. Amon Arenas certainly knew what was happening in Egypt when Rome was taking over, because she and her husband were prepared for a Roman invasion, to the point where they decided to strike first. So they knew each other. They had this relationship, and so she for sure is hands down, I think, my favorite. But the other one is, yeah, there she is, so determined. Like, she she lost her husband. He died in battle. She kept fighting. Her son came in. She lost her son. She lost her eye. She kept fighting. It's just, she was just an incredible person. The other person I think is like my next favorite probably is Tin Hin On, who, like, she walked into the desert and like founded this city in the Sahara. Like, who does that? This one lady, she did that. It's incredible. I think the women in this story, in this book, are just so strong and so incredible and so capable, in particular. The men as well, but especially for a world that really has favored men for centuries and centuries, that these women came out swinging is one of my favorite things to discover and to write about as I was working on this book.
And as I was reading Amon Arenas' story, I thought I would watch a movie about this woman. I'm actually several of them. I thought we need Hollywood blockbuster movies. Well, maybe not Hollywood, maybe. So in Ghana we have Gollywood, and we have Nollywood in Nigeria. So they could also take this on and do an excellent job. But I thought I would love to watch movies that really, portray these figures, these women, their strengths, and the fact that they were able to accomplish so much in the world, like you said, that wasn't always kind to people, period, but especially to women, and to be able to amass power and to lead and to garner respect. There's just so many stories waiting to be told. Anyway, so I was reading the book and I was so excited. I was like, movie. I see movies all across. So you speak about women, and I wondered, was there a commonality that you saw? Because these were women from different cultures across Africa, different time periods. So we don't expect that they're going to be identical in any way. But were there similarities that you found? So I'm currently studying women traditional leaders, including women chiefs. And when people talk about chiefs in Africa, they tend not to speak about women. And when they speak about women leaders in Africa, they speak about like women presidents and women cabinet members and women parliamentarians, but not women chiefs. So it's like women chiefs are almost forgotten in a lot of the scholarship. But also just in public discourse, popular culture, they don't come up as often, even though they play such an important role. So anyway, I'm very much interested in women's leadership across time, across the continent. And so I wondered, were there any similarities that you saw within the women that you studied?
The one thing that I would say is that they were all very forward thinking. So they saw what was happening around them. They understood what was happening politically, what was happening socially, and they planned to do something about it. You know, they really were on the forefront of whatever was the next iteration of what was going to happen in their lands, in their societies, in their cultures. So with Amanirenas, you know, she and her husband saw that Egypt had fallen to Rome. They planned to go out and meet Rome because they did not want their lands to fall to Rome. With Tin Hinan, she saw that, you know, there was trade happening across the Sahara, and she saw an opportunity to have kind of a landing base inside of the desert so that it would make the desert crossing a little less dangerous for the people who were coming through, but would also bring a lot of wealth to her and the people who followed her into the desert to found this particular city. With Queen Idia, she saw that the Portuguese were going to make their way down the west coast of Africa. They weren't doing it yet, but she predicted that they were going to get there eventually, and that her people were going to have to deal with the Portuguese in some way. So she made sure that her son knew how to speak Portuguese and knew how to deal with these people. And she then made sure that he was the one who succeeded his father because she knew that he was going to be the right person to lead them in the right direction. And even going back to Merneith, who's the first woman who is discussed, you know, she really took over the job as pharaoh for her son and held everything together while her son was growing up and learning how to become the pharaoh. So these women were all very forward thinking. They were thinking about, it was not about themselves. They were thinking about their people and their culture and how their culture was going to move forward for the next generation and for generations to come. And I think that's why these women were so successful at what they did and were so powerful and had such an impact.
Mm-hmm. And that is a mark of true leadership. And I think even now that I have conversations with people and which is why I think that this is a book that's not only important for people outside of Africa, but even people within Africa. Because you do every once in a while to speak to that one person who's like, women, this is, we don't, historically, women have not been leaders. And I always think it's because you don't know history. That's why you think this. Because we don't have to go back 1,000 years to find. And the fact is that in many countries, these women leaders were the exception. But I think that's also the case in most parts of the world. Right. And just that there just needs to be more recognition, and there needs to be, people need to know about this. So anyway, for that, it's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this book. Yeah, so if there are any questions, please ask, but I will also keep asking my questions here. I can go on forever. I could like talk about each of these 30 figures and we'll be here all night, but I will not do that. I want to ask you about this cover and the illustrations. What role did you play in creating all of this? It's such a striking cover. And I was also thinking that, well, for some of these people we are writing about, we don't actually have any images of them.
Right, yeah.
So what went into creating the people that we don't really know exactly what they look like?
Yeah, so the illustrations are done by Hilary Wilson. And yeah, I mean, she does, she does such a beautiful job of capturing each of the icons, and you look at them and you feel like these people, right? Like this one, Imhotep, this is one of my favorite ones because he sort of looks like my son a little bit, which is really funny to me. The thing that she did, we did have conversations. So the idea had always been to have the book illustrated, so that the icons each would get sort of like this hero shot, right? So that you can get a sense of who this person was and their personality. And that the Aesop one is so, it's one of my favorite ones. I mean, they're all so gorgeous, but Aesop is like particularly striking to me because it's not what I had ever thought Aesop looked like. It's such it really just kind of unmasks so many things. But anyway, so Hillary is, she does medical illustrations as well. That's part of her background. So she was able to think about the time period that each of these icons lived in and the location that they lived in, because that has a lot to do with the shape of the person's face, the particular features that they would have, and also their skin tone. So when you look at Aesop, for example, with a much darker skin tone, a wider nose, and a stronger cheekbone, it's very, very different from, say, Tin Hinan, who has a lighter skin tone, something that's a little bit more sallow. She has more delicate features. Her nose is a little bit straighter. It's because of where they lived on the continent that made the difference in what they look like, but also the time period that they lived. And so we had not many. I mean, Hillary really did her own research in trying to figure this out, but we would have, a few conversations back and forth about that, when it was happening, what kind of clothing people might have worn, what kind of jewelry they might have worn, and things like that, so she could get something accurate. With the Aesop portrait, for example, he is obviously an Ethiopian figure, but he's wearing Greek clothing. He's wearing that draped clothing that they wore in Greece, because of course that's where he lived. So she really thought through a lot of those details to make sure that she was getting an illustration that looked, pretty close to what somebody from that time period and from that place would have looked like. Obviously we can't get it exact because we don't have any photos. The only one that we have actual reference for was the final icon, Queen Adia, because one of the things that was her claim to fame was that her son had several carvings made of her. So we have like actual, little statues and ivory carvings and copper, copper busts that show exactly what she looked like. So we know exactly what Adia looked like, but none of the others. All of them are, using our best guess based on what we know and the information that we have. But all of them look so realistic. They look so real because she did a lot of research to make sure that it was accurately depicting people from that time and from that place.
I mean, the research comes through when you look at it. You look at the images. It shows that there's a lot of thought that has gone to creating this, and there's a lot of detail. And now that you say it, I'm looking at them again and actually seeing how much work went into them. Something else that I see is the symbols. There are a lot of symbols, and I come from Ghana, and I recognize some of the Adinkra symbols as well. Could you tell us a bit about what the symbols mean and why you chose to include them?
Well, this actually was the designer's ideas. So Sarah Jonas was the designer, and Algonquin was really, really great about finding a designer who really could take on the imagery that, the African imagery. And so she was thinking about, if you look at the one of Imhotep, for example, that's one of my favorite sort of image and imagery combinations, because one of the things that Imhotep was most famous for was architecture. So he was the very first architect who was named in world history. And the image symbol that goes with him, if you look at it, it's very mathematical. It's a tessellation, and it really suits him. So she really thought about each of the icons and the kind of symbolism that would match them the best. But she also did do research into actual, like African imagery and symbolism, so that she could produce the kinds of images that would match certain places and certain time periods, really exactly the way that Hillary did with the illustrations.
Well, I think the three of you have come together to create this really great resource that I'm really hoping that lots of young people, and like I said before, not so young people, will read. And I so agree with you that hopefully it will be the beginning of more of such resources, and will generate more interest in this very important topic. Can I ask what's next for you?
So I have a picture book that's coming out in January that's called Because Claudette. It's about Claudette Colvin, who was 15 years old when she refused to give up her seat on the bus, and was the very first person to do that. And it sort of sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts. So she actually did this before Rosa Parks did. And she and Rosa Parks actually became friends during all of that. And I am currently working on a couple of other books, mostly fiction at the moment, because, as I mentioned before, nonfiction the research is not really my forte. I mean, I do it, but fiction is definitely, making stuff up is definitely a lot easier than trying to find information.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. So now you've got me, I guess, paying more attention to young adults writing. I might just read everything else.
I'm thinking that story about your great grandmother might be for young adults and not for adults. Things to think about.
I see. I have to say it. But I'm really excited. I'm really glad that you did this. Final question: If people have read this and they're like, I'm really interested in this subject, is there any way you can direct them to either to a particular book or to particular books or to other resources that you think?
Yeah, I mean, at the back, I think I have, let's see, in addition to the source notes, I think there was a further reading. No, in the bibliography, there is a lot of more information, and then there is some further exploration. So if people want to check out some additional materials, there is the further exploration section that they can go to.
Okay, so people, please explore further. Thank you so much, Tracey. This has been.
Thank you, Peace. That was great. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you.